Wyoming Territory, late autumn, 1884. The wind moved like a restless animal across the open plain, carrying with it the grit of red earth and the sharp scent of sage. The small settlement of Frontier Gulch clung stubbornly to the railroad line, a handful of clapboard buildings hunched against the chill, their windows glowing faintly in the falling dusk. The train that had roared through only an hour before was now a fading memory, its whistle already swallowed by the empty miles. On the platform, Eleanor Gray stood alone, her gloved hands tightened around the handle of a worn carpetbag, the leather edges scuffed from too many journeys that ended nowhere. Her breath misted in the air, curling upward like a ghost. She had been the last passenger to step off, and she remained the last soul lingering after all others had been claimed, greeted by husbands, brothers, merchants with wagons. Families had called out with laughter, arms thrown around wives or children returning from the east, but no one had come for her. She stood still as the dust swirled at her boots. Beneath the brim of her bonnet, her face held steady, but her spine carried the stiffness of humiliation. It was not the first time. It might not even be the last. From the pocket of her wool coat, she pulled a folded letter. Its paper softened at the creases from being read too many times. The handwriting belonged to Nathaniel Croft, a man who claimed to be a rancher in these parts. I have a quiet home, a warm hearth, and a place where a kind soul might belong. Those words had traveled with her across miles of prairie and weeks of waiting. She had dared to believe them. And yet, there was no wagon, no invitation, only silence. Somewhere near the freight barrels, two young men lounged, their voices carrying in the cold. "There she is," one muttered, his smirk visible even through the dimming light. "Thought she'd marry herself a cattleman. Did she? A fine prize for a half-breed." The words struck Eleanor like a slap, though she did not flinch. She had heard them before in towns, in churches, whispered behind hands or spat outright. Her mother had been Comanche, her father a cavalry officer. She was born from violence, not choice, and the world never let her forget it. 3 times men had promised her marriage. 3 times those promises had dissolved into shame when her bloodline was named aloud. Her eyes blurred with sudden heat, and though she had sworn never to weep where others could see, a tear slid free, falling onto the wrinkled letter in her hand. She sank onto the rough bench, shoulders curling inward against the weight of her own history. It was then she heard the sound of small footsteps. A little girl, no more than 3, stood before her. She wore a wool coat several sizes too large, the sleeves falling over her tiny fists. Mittens dangled from a string around her neck, and from beneath her knitted cap spilled a tangle of golden curls. Her wide eyes studied Eleanor with a seriousness that belonged to someone older than her years. "Are you hurt?" the child asked. Eleanor startled, dabbing quickly at her cheeks with her sleeve. "No, darling," she whispered, forcing a smile. "I'm just a little sad." The girl tilted her head thoughtfully. "Did your papa say no?" Eleanor blinked. "No, sweetheart, I don't have a papa anymore. Do you have a husband?" Eleanor shook her head. "Tss." The movement slow, heavy. "Do you have a baby?" Another shake. Her voice cracked when she managed. "Nobody wants me." The child frowned at this. Then, with the certainty only innocence can muster, she reached out her mittened hand and touched Eleanor's gloved fingers. "Can you be my mommy? Forever." Eleanor froze. The words pierced deeper than any insult could. Something inside her chest tightened painfully, and she could not form an answer. "Margaret." The name came in a low voice, steady as gravel shifting under boot. Eleanor looked up. A man approached, his steps measured, his shoulders broad beneath a patched coat. His dark hair showed threads of early gray at the temples, and the brim of his hat was frayed from years of weather. He carried a sack of supplies in one arm, and with the other he rested a protective hand on the little girl's shoulder. His face was worn, weathered by sun and sorrow, but his eyes deep-set, unreadable, held a quiet steadiness. "Sorry," he said, his tone rough but not unkind. "She's got a soft heart." Eleanor rose quickly, brushing at the dust on her skirt. "It's no trouble. She only surprised me. The man's gaze flicked to the letter crushed in Eleanor's hand, then returned to her face. "You waiting on someone?" Her lips parted, but she hesitated before admitting, "I was, but it seems I've been fooled again." The man studied her for a long moment, then looked down at the child tugging at his coat. "Papa," she whispered insistently. "She's sad." His jaw tightened. When he turned back to Eleanor, the weariness in his eyes had softened slightly. "You've got no place to stay." "No," Eleanor admitted, her voice low. "But I'll manage." The man shifted the sack in his arm. His voice carried no embellishment, no flourish, just a simple offer. "It's cold tonight. If you want a roof and a bowl of broth, you're welcome to rest a while." Eleanor's heart thudded. She blinked at him, startled by the generosity of a stranger when so many others turned away. "I don't even know your name." "Jonas," he said. "Jonas Hale." He gestured toward the dirt path leading out of town. "It isn't far. You can leave after supper if you'd rather." Eleanor looked down at the child Maggie, she thought, who still clung to her hand with surprising trust. The warmth of that tiny grip spread through her like the smallest flame in a long winter. She nodded once. "Thank you." And so, with the last of the daylight fading to violet over the Wyoming hills, Eleanor Gray gathered her carpetbag and followed Jonas Hale and his daughter down the winding trail. Not with hope, not yet, but with a fragile flicker of something that might, if she allowed it, become the beginning of home. The path wound away from the station into a thin line of pines that clung to the rocky hills. Twilight deepened, laying a violet haze over the land, and the air carried the bite of early winter. Eleanor's boots crunched over frozen earth as she trailed a few steps behind Jonas Hale and his daughter. The little girl Maggie skipped now and then, despite the chill, her mittened hand gripping her father's sleeve. Eleanor's carpetbag felt heavier with each step. It was not the weight of cloth or books inside, but the weight of uncertainty, of a woman who had once again been left unwanted. Still, she followed. The faintest glow flickered ahead, and soon the shape of a cabin took form in the hollow of the hill. Jonas's home was smaller than Eleanor expected. A one-room cabin of rough-hewn logs, a lean porch held up by beams scarred from wind and rain. Thin smoke curled from a narrow chimney, carrying the comforting smell of wood smoke. In the failing light, the place looked both lonely and enduring, like its owner. At the door, Jonas set down his sack and pushed the latch open. Warmth met them instantly, heat from a stone hearth licking through the air, shadows stretching long across plank walls. Eleanor hesitated on the threshold. This was not her home. She was not meant to belong here. But Maggie tugged gently at her hand and whispered, "It's warm inside." She stepped in. The interior was sparse, a single bed pushed against the far wall, a cot folded nearby, a rocking chair by the fire. A table of rough boards held a tin kettle and 3 clay bowls. Yet everything was clean, ordered, touched by the steady discipline of a man who had kept his world small but livable. "You can hang your coat there," Jonas said, nodding toward a peg by the door. He stooped to remove his boots, his movements unhurried. Eleanor slid her carpetbag onto the floor. "I won't stay long," she murmured, though the warmth of the room already loosened the cold ache from her bones. "That's up to you," Jonas replied without glancing at her. "I didn't bring you here to stay forever, just the night." The bluntness made her cheeks flush, yet beneath it she sensed no cruelty, only plain honesty. She drew a long breath and lowered herself into the rocking chair, her gloved hands folded tightly in her lap. Maggie clambered onto the bench by the hearth, humming a little tune. Jonas unpacked his sack, set a pot over the fire, and stirred a stew that smelled of root vegetables and venison. Silence filled the room except for the crackle of logs and the occasional squeal of the iron pot. Eleanor wanted to speak, but the words knotted in her throat. When the stew was served, they ate quietly. Jonas bent his head to the bowl. Maggie slurped with unashamed delight, and Eleanor forced herself to swallow despite the tightness in her chest. She had not shared a meal with anyone in weeks. She had almost forgotten the sound of another person breathing across the table. After supper, Eleanor rose. "Thank you for the meal. I should go." She bent to retrieve her bag, but before she could step toward the door, Maggie darted forward and clung to her skirts. "No," the child cried. "You said you didn't have a house." "This is one." "Stay here." Eleanor crouched to meet her eyes. "Sweetheart, this isn't my home." "It can be, just for a little," Maggie pleaded, lip trembling. Eleanor looked helplessly toward Jonas. He leaned back in his chair, arms folded. His expression was unreadable, but his voice was steady. "She gets attached fast. I can sleep by the hearth," Eleanor offered quietly. "Just for tonight." Jonas studied her for a long moment before nodding once. "Take the cot. I'll stay up." Eleanor's gaze wandered then, and she noticed something tucked in the corner. A small dress, beaded and handmade in the style of native girls, hung neatly from a peg. Below it, a carved wooden shelf held a feather, a pouch of dried sage, and a string of turquoise beads. The sight made her chest tighten. She was Comanche, Eleanor whispered, not realizing she had spoken aloud. "Her name was Ayanna," Jonas said from behind her, his voice flat, though his hand stilled on the chair. "She died last winter. Fever came with the frost. Took her quick." Eleanor turned slowly. His face was shadowed by firelight, but his eyes betrayed a wound that had never healed. "I'm sorry," she said softly. Jonas gave no reply. He rose, tossed another log on the fire, and busied himself with small tasks. Eleanor stood still, her heart caught between sorrow and recognition. Here was a man who had chosen love across boundaries and paid dearly for it. She felt the kinship of scars, the quiet knowing of being marked by bloodlines the world condemned. Later, when Maggie had curled into blankets and drifted into sleep, Eleanor sat near the window with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Jonas remained on the other side of the room, his chair tilted back, his gaze fixed on the fire. "You can stay a few days," he said at last, his voice quiet but firm. "She's calm when you're here." Eleanor looked at him, the flickering light painting his features with lines of weariness. She wanted to argue, to insist she would not impose. But the truth was she longed for warmth, for rest, for the sound of a child breathing softly in the dark. She only nodded. "That's all right," she murmured. "I won't ask for more." He inclined his head once, as though sealing a bargain, and though no further words were spoken, the cabin no longer felt like a place meant only for one. That night, Eleanor lay awake on the cot, the shadows of the fire flickering across the low ceiling. She listened to the even breaths of the child, the creak of the rocking chair where Jonas still sat, unwilling to surrender to sleep. Beyond the cabin walls, the Wyoming wind howled against the hills. But inside, for the first time in many years, Eleanor felt a fragile safety, not belonging, no, not yet, but the beginning of something she had nearly given up believing in. The first snow came silently, drifting down from a gray sky that had brooded all morning. By nightfall, the ground lay thinly covered, every fence post crowned with white, every tree limb shivering under its new burden. Inside the cabin, the fire burned steady, but a chill still clung to the corners. Eleanor stitched by the hearth while Maggie played with a rag doll near her father's boots. Jonas sharpened a hunting knife, his strokes slow, deliberate, almost meditative. It had been 3 days since Eleanor first stepped across the Hale threshold. 3 days of meals shared in uneasy silence. 3 nights of Maggie pressing close against her as if she had known her forever. Eleanor had tried not to linger in the comfort, reminding herself it was borrowed time. Yet she caught herself humming as she worked, the rhythm of domesticity tugging at places she thought long numb. That night, however, the rhythm broke. Maggie's laughter quieted suddenly. She set aside her doll and curled up on the cot, her small body trembling. "Cold," she whispered, though her cheeks burned with an unnatural flush. Jonas dropped the knife, his face draining of color. He pressed a hand to his daughter's forehead and jerked it back. Stricken. "She's burning," he muttered. "Dear God, she's burning." Eleanor rose at once, the needle sliding forgotten to the floor. She knelt by the cot, laying her palm against Maggie's skin. The heat pulsed beneath her hand like fire under thin glass. The girl's breaths came shallow, her lips parting in faint gasps. "It's a fever," Eleanor said, forcing calm into her voice. "A bad one." Jonas's composure shattered. He stood, paced the length of the cabin, fists clenching uselessly. She was fine this morning, running in the yard, singing like always. Now his words broke. "We have to get her to town. There's a doctor." Eleanor shook her head firmly. "Not tonight. The road is iced over already. A wagon would kill her before the fever does." "Then what do we do?" His voice rose, harsh with fear. His hands, usually steady with rifle or hammer, trembled as they hovered helplessly above his daughter's body. "I don't know what to do." Eleanor touched his arm gently, her own fear hidden deep. "I do." Jonas stared at her, disbelief and desperate hope warring in his eyes. My father was a healer among the Kiowa," she said quietly. "He taught me what plants fight fever, what roots bring the sweat, what leaves ease the lungs. It's all I have. Jonas, let me try." He hesitated only a breath before nodding sharply. "Do it." Eleanor moved swiftly. From her carpet bag she pulled bundles of dried herbs wrapped in cloth, things she had carried out of habit, half expecting never to need them again. Now her hand shook only once before finding the rhythm she had learned years ago: crush the willow bark, steep the sage, pound the roots of yarrow. Steam soon filled the air, carrying bitter scents that curled with the smoke of the fire. Jonas hovered at the edge of her work, his jaw set tight, his eyes locked on the little girl writhing weakly against the quilt. "She's all I have," he whispered hoarsely. "She's not alone tonight," Eleanor murmured back, wringing a cloth in the herbal brew and laying it gently on Maggie's chest. The child whimpered but did not wake. Eleanor's hand stroked her hair, her voice slipping into lullabies she hadn't sung in years, songs in a tongue Jonas did not know but found strangely soothing. Hours passed. Jonas did not move from the stool beside the cot, his elbows braced on his knees, his face carved with lines of fear. His eyes followed every gesture Eleanor made, the careful drip of bitter tea between Maggie's lips, the changing of damp cloths, the steady wiping of sweat. At one point, he broke the silence. "You've done this before." "Yes," she replied softly. "Twice. One boy could hardly breathe after a winter hunt. Another burned for days. They lived." Jonas swallowed hard, his throat working. "You sound more sure than most doctors." "I had to be." Her voice carried no pride, only truth. "Where I grew up, no one came for us when we were sick. We had only what we could make with our own hands." Jonas studied her then, really studied her, the calm in her eyes, the tenderness in her touch, the way she bent over his daughter as if the child were her own flesh. Something inside him shifted, like ice cracking on a river's surface. He was not used to being the one who needed saving. He was not used to trusting. Yet here he sat, his entire world lying fevered on the cot, and it was Eleanor Gray who stood between life and death. Midnight came, the fire burning low. Eleanor dabbed Maggie's forehead, whispering encouragement, though the girl could not hear. Jonas's hand gripped the edge of the cot until his knuckles whitened, and then a stir. Maggie whimpered, shifted, and her eyes fluttered open. Still glazed, still weak, but clearer. She reached blindly until her small fingers found Eleanor's hand and clutched tight. "Mommy," she breathed, voice no louder than a sigh. Eleanor froze. Her throat constricted, tears burning her eyes. She looked helplessly toward Jonas, who inhaled sharply, his whole body taut. "She doesn't understand," Eleanor whispered, ashamed of the rush of longing in her chest. Jonas's face was unreadable in the firelight, but when he finally spoke, his voice was low and raw. "She knows what feels safe." The room held its breath. Maggie drifted back into sleep, her small hand still curled in Eleanor's. Outside, the wind rattled against the shutters, but inside the cabin, a fragile hope flickered to life. Jonas watched the two of them, the woman who was not meant to stay, and the child who had already claimed her, and for the first time in years, he felt the terrifying possibility of love pressing against his guarded heart. Eleanor did not sleep that night. She sat by Maggie until dawn, feeding the fire, renewing the cloths, whispering words of comfort. And when at last the child's fever broke with a sheen of sweat, Eleanor bowed her head in weary relief. Jonas poured a cup of coffee as the morning light broke through the frosted window. He set it silently before her. He did not thank her, but his eyes said everything his mouth could not yet form. The fever had passed, but its shadow lingered. For 2 days, Maggie lay weak under quilts, her small body damp with the sweat that marked her survival. Eleanor stayed close, coaxing broth past her lips, smoothing her hair with gentle hands. Jonas never strayed far either, though he moved with a kind of stunned quietness, as if the ground beneath him had shifted and he wasn't sure yet where to place his feet. When Maggie laughed again, thin but bright, something inside the cabin changed. The silence that once pressed heavily between Eleanor and Jonas eased, replaced by moments of hesitant conversation. Eleanor found herself humming as she mended Maggie's dress. Jonas surprised her one evening by leaving a piece of rabbit meat on her plate without a word, his rough way of showing gratitude. They were small gestures, but to Eleanor they felt enormous. Yet beneath the warmth, doubts coiled. She knew what people said of her. She had been unwanted too many times to mistake kindness for permanence. And Jonas, though gentler than she had expected, was still a man bound tight by grief. His heart, she suspected, was buried with the wife he had lost. On the 3rd night after the fever broke, Eleanor stepped onto the porch to breathe the cold air. The moon hung low above the hills, silvering the snow into a pale glow. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and let the quiet of the night soak into her. A moment later, the floor creaked behind her. Jonas came out, his hat pulled low, arms folded across his chest. For a while, they stood side by side, saying nothing, only the night wind moving between them. Then he cleared his throat. "You've got steady hands," he said gruffly. "Saved her." Eleanor kept her eyes on the horizon. "I only did what I was taught." "Still," he said, voice low, "you kept her here when I thought she was slipping away. I won't forget that." She swallowed hard. The compliment, simple as it was, pierced deeper than any fine words could. After a silence, she spoke. "Do you ever get tired of the whispers?" Jonas's head turned slightly. "What whispers? You know what I mean," she said bitterly. "About who we are, where we come from, about blood we never chose." His jaw tightened, but he did not look away. "They've whispered about me since the day I brought Ayanna into town. Said she bewitched me. Said our daughter wouldn't belong to God. And when she died, they whispered that it was punishment for mixing blood." Eleanor closed her eyes. The pain in his voice echoed too close to her own. "I've been called half-breed since I was old enough to walk. Men swore love to me, then left me at the altar when they remembered the truth of my blood. One even sent his mother to send me away like I was filth. Another said the vows, put the ring on my hand, then vanished before the night was done." Jonas was silent a long time. Finally he said, "People are cruel when they're afraid of what they don't understand." She gave a bitter laugh. "Afraid of me? I'm just a woman who wanted a place to belong." His gaze lingered on her, steady, unreadable. "So am I." The words hung between them, heavy with unspoken things. Inside, Maggie stirred in her sleep, and the moment broke. Jonas shifted, tugging his coat tighter. Eleanor looked down at her hands, ashamed of the tremble in her chest. The following day brought a different trial. A man named Roy Beckett rode up to the cabin, his horse kicking up clumps of frozen earth. Beckett was a neighbor of sorts. His ranch stretched the next valley over, but his reputation carried more venom than kindness. He was broad-shouldered, sharp-eyed, and known in town for his wagging tongue. Jonas Hale Beckett called as he swung down from his horse. "Heard you've taken in some stray from the rail line." His gaze slid to Eleanor, lingering with mockery. Well, you've moved fast. Folks are saying you couldn't wait a year before replacing Ayanna." Eleanor stiffened, her face flushing hot despite the cold. Jonas stepped forward, his expression turning to stone. "Mind your business, Beckett." But Beckett only smirked. "It is my business if you're housing a woman who'll bleed you dry. Word in town is she's been turned away more times than a drunk at Sunday service. What's she after?" "Jonas, your land, your name." Eleanor's throat tightened. Shame, old and familiar, clawed up from her belly. She clutched her shawl tighter, wishing she could vanish into the snow. Jonas's voice came out low, controlled, but edged with steel. "That's enough," Beckett laughed, swinging back onto his horse. Don't say I didn't warn you. People remember. Jonas. They always do." With that, he spurred the animal and rode off, leaving only the echo of his cruelty. Eleanor turned away quickly, fighting tears. She had known it couldn't last the fragile warmth, the flicker of safety. All it took was one man's tongue to remind her of her place. That night, she packed her carpet bag. Jonas found her by the door, her bonnet already tied, her hands trembling on the bag's handle. "You're leaving," he said flatly. "I won't be the cause of more whispers." She whispered back, "Your neighbors are right. I have no place here." His eyes hardened, but beneath the hardness was something else, something like fear. "Maggie will ask for you when she wakes." Eleanor's chest ached. "She'll forget me in time." Jonas stepped closer, his presence filling the small space between them. "Don't presume to know my daughter's heart, and don't presume to decide mine, either." Her lips parted, but no words came. He held her gaze, his own steady, unflinching. For a long moment, it felt as if the whole world had narrowed to the space of that cabin, to the question unspoken between them: would she stay, or would she run? The fire snapped loudly, startling them both. Eleanor dropped her eyes, her hand still trembling on the carpet bag. She could not answer him yet, but deep inside, a battle raged between the fear that had ruled her life and the fragile hope that had begun to grow. The wind sharpened as December pressed harder against the Wyoming hills. Snow lay deeper now, glinting like shards of glass beneath a pale winter sun. The cabin creaked with each gust, yet inside there was warmth, a fragile rhythm of shared meals, gentle laughter, and nights by the fire. Eleanor tried not to think too much of it, but sometimes when Maggie curled against her side with the easy trust of a child, her heart betrayed her with aching hope. Still, doubt clung like frost to the windows. Beckett's cruel words echoed in her mind. She knew how swiftly gossip spread in small towns, how quickly kindness could curdle into judgment. More than once she caught Jonas watching her as if weighing something, whether to trust her presence or brace for her departure. One afternoon, the hush broke. Eleanor was hanging a quilt on the line outside when she noticed the yard was too quiet. No childish hums, no soft giggles. She turned, heart tightening. Maggie silence. Panic surged. She dropped the quilt and scanned the snowy field. The gate near the tree line stood ajar, swinging in the wind. Her breath caught in her throat. Maggie. Her voice tore across the stillness. She ran, boots crunching hard over snow. Tracks tiny prints leading toward the stream. Eleanor's pulse hammered as she followed them, her skirts snagging on brush. Then she saw it, a red ribbon tangled on a thorn bush, the one Maggie had tied in her hair that morning. Beyond, the sound of rushing water. When Eleanor broke through the trees, her heart nearly stopped. The stream, swollen with melting ice, rushed swift and merciless. In its current, a small figure flailed Maggie, her arms thrashing, her cries barely rising above the roar. Her little hands clawed at a branch, slipping. "Hold on." Eleanor's voice was raw as she tore off her shawl and coat. She plunged into the water before thought could catch her. The cold was a blade. It stabbed through her skin, her chest, her spine, seizing her lungs. Still she fought forward, boots dragging against the mud, arms slicing the current. "Maggie, look at me," the girl sobbed, choking, her face pale against the dark water. Eleanor reached, straining, her muscles burning. At last her fingers caught the child beneath the arms. With every ounce of strength, she heaved Maggie upward, shoving her onto a half-submerged rock. "Stay here. Hold tight," Eleanor gasped. Maggie clung to the rock, trembling, but Eleanor's relief was short. Her foot had wedged between two stones below, trapped. She tugged. Kicked pain shot up her leg. The water clawed at her chest, dragging her down. Papa Maggie screamed, her voice breaking. Eleanor's arms burned. Her breath came ragged. The world narrowed to the terror in the child's eyes. She tried again, pulling with all her might, but the river held her fast. Darkness pressed at the edges of her vision, and then boots thundered on the bank. Jonas. He crashed through the brush, his eyes widening with horror. "Maggie, Papa," the girl sobbed, clinging to the rock. Jonas didn't hesitate. He threw himself into the water, the current surging against his massive frame. In 2 strides, he reached Maggie, lifted her free, and shoved her toward the bank. Then he turned for Eleanor. She was already limp, the water dragging her sideways. Jonas lunged, catching her beneath the arms. "I've got you," he growled, voice breaking. "I've got you both." The current fought him, but rage and terror lent him strength. He wrenched Eleanor free from the stones, hauling her against his chest, and staggered toward shore. By the time he dragged them onto the frozen ground, his lungs burned like fire. Maggie sobbed into his coat, clutching at him. He pulled her close with one arm, while the other held Eleanor tight. Her skin was ice, her lips blue, her breath faint. "Stay with me," Jonas whispered, desperation cracking through every word. He gathered both of them and stumbled toward the cabin, driven by sheer will. Inside, he kicked the door shut and dropped to his knees by the hearth. The fire roared as he threw every log he owned onto the flames. With trembling hands, he stripped Eleanor's soaked clothes, careful, rough, not lingering where he had no right. He wrapped her in every dry blanket, pulled her into his arms, pressed his own warmth against her frozen body. "Stay with me," he begged, rocking her slightly. "Don't leave. Please don't leave." Maggie, exhausted from tears, curled beside them, her small hand clutching Eleanor's shawl. Jonas held Eleanor through the night, feeding the fire, rubbing warmth into her limbs, whispering words he hadn't spoken since his wife's death. "I can't lose you. Not you, too. Please, Eleanor." His voice broke, but the tears would not come, only the raw ache of a man who had lost too much already. Toward dawn, she stirred. A faint breath shivered from her lips. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then locking on his face. "Maggie," she rasped. "She's safe," Jonas whispered, brushing damp hair from her cheek with a hand that trembled. "Because of you." Her body shook violently, but her voice came steady. "I couldn't let her go. I know." His own voice cracked, his forehead pressing briefly to hers. "You didn't. You saved her. You saved us." For a moment he could not speak further. Then, softer than a prayer, "Don't ever leave again. Eleanor, don't. Please." Her hand found his, weak but sure, curling over his rough fingers. "I wasn't planning to." Something inside Jonas broke, then not in pain, but in surrender. For the first time since Ayanna's death, he allowed himself to want, to hope, to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could love again. And in the pale light of morning, with Maggie sleeping safely nearby and Eleanor breathing against his chest, Jonas Hale understood this woman had not just saved his daughter's life. She had saved his own heart from drowning too. Morning broke slow and pale, the sky the color of pewter, the air heavy with silence after the storm of the night. Inside the cabin, the fire had dwindled to glowing coals, filling the room with a soft orange haze. Jonas had not slept. He sat slumped against the wall, Eleanor curled in his arms, Maggie nestled close against her side. His body ached from hours of holding them both, but he did not loosen his grip. He was afraid that if he let go, they might vanish like smoke. Eleanor stirred at last, her lashes trembling before her eyes blinked open. She looked dazed, her breath shallow, her lips pale but alive. For a moment she seemed confused, unsure of where she was. Then her gaze settled on Jonas, and a flicker of recognition crossed her face. "Maggie," she whispered hoarsely. "She's safe." Jonas answered at once, nodding toward the child sleeping soundly under the quilts. Warm and breathing. Relief softened Eleanor's face, her hand, weak but steady, shifted to brush a stray curl from Maggie's forehead. "Thank God," she breathed. Jonas swallowed hard, his throat tight. He had thought he knew gratitude before, but what coursed through him now felt more than gratitude. It felt like a vow etched into his bones. "You almost died for her," he said, his voice rough. Eleanor met his eyes. "She's worth it." Jonas's jaw worked. He wanted to say more, to speak the words clawing at his chest. But for a man who had lived in silence for so long, words did not come easy. He only tightened the blankets around her and pressed her hand to his chest. letting the steadiness of his heartbeat speak in place of what his mouth could not yet form. By midday, Eleanor was strong enough to sit near the fire, wrapped in shawls while Maggie fussed over her with childlike seriousness. "You can't leave again," Maggie insisted, crawling onto her lap. "Not ever," Eleanor laughed softly, though tears shimmered in her eyes. "I wasn't planning to." Jonas stood in the doorway, watching them, his daughter's golden head pressed against Eleanor's shoulder. Eleanor's arm curled protectively around the small body. The sight made something break open in him, something he had kept sealed since the day Ayanna was buried under the cedar tree. When Eleanor glanced up, she caught the look on his face, raw, unguarded. For once, he didn't look away. That night, after Maggie had fallen asleep, the cabin was quiet except for the crackle of fire. Eleanor sat at the table, mending a tear in her skirt. Jonas leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, but his gaze was restless. Finally, he stepped forward. "I need to say something," he began, his voice low. Eleanor looked up, needle pausing mid-stitch. "I didn't write those letters," Jonas admitted. His jaw tightened, as though the words were hard to drag free. "Didn't plan for any of this for you." But he hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "When I saw you holding her, when I heard you call her safe, I realized." He stopped, swallowed, tried again. "I realized I don't want you to go." Eleanor's breath caught. "Jonas, I'm not asking for promises." He rushed on, his voice rough. "I don't have rings or vows polished by a preacher. All I've got is this roof that leaks in spring, a fence half broke, and a girl who needs more than I can give. But if you're willing, if you want, stay." The silence stretched. Eleanor stared at him, her chest aching with a mixture of fear and longing. For so long, every man who touched her life had walked away once they remembered her blood, her past. But here stood Jonas Hale scarred, grieving, unpolished, and yet offering her something no one else had dared a choice. She rose slowly, setting aside the needle and cloth. Her steps were unsteady, but she crossed the room until she stood before him. "I don't want just a roof," she said softly, "or a fence, or someone who lets me stay out of pity. I want a family." Jonas's breath shuddered, his eyes, usually guarded, filled with something fierce and unspoken. "Then stay," he whispered. Eleanor reached for his hand, curling her smaller fingers over his calloused ones. "I will." For a long moment they simply stood there, hand in hand, the fire's glow wrapping them in fragile warmth. No kiss passed between them, no declarations of love, but in the silence lay something stronger, an unspoken promise, fragile yet enduring, that neither of them would walk away this time. The following days passed like a dream Eleanor scarcely dared to trust. She mended clothes while Jonas chopped wood, Maggie trailing between them with questions and laughter. At night they sat together by the fire, Jonas telling short, clipped stories of his youth, Eleanor sharing fragments of old songs. There were still silences, still shadows that clung, but the edges of loneliness softened. Once, while Eleanor stirred stew at the hearth, Maggie tugged her skirt and whispered, "You're my mommy now." Eleanor bent, pressing her lips to the child's golden hair. "Yes, sweetheart, if you'll have me." From the table, Jonas watched, his expression unreadable, but his eyes shining with something that made Eleanor's heart swell and tremble all at once. On the evening of the first thaw, as snow melted into rivulets along the path, Jonas stepped outside with Eleanor at his side. The sky blazed with streaks of amber and violet. Maggie skipped ahead, her laughter carrying across the yard. Jonas's hand brushed against Eleanor's. For a moment, she thought he would pull back, but instead, his fingers closed around hers, rough and sure. They stood in silence, watching the sun sink behind the hills. And in that quiet, Jonas spoke the words he had carried like a burden for so long. "You're not here because I pity you. You're here because I want you here. Both of us do." Eleanor's eyes filled. She squeezed his hand. "Then I'll never leave." And for the first time in her life, the promise did not taste like hope destined to fail. It tasted like home. Spring returned slowly to the Wyoming hill, the snow retreating in patches until green shoots pushed through the damp soil. The land smelled of thawed earth and wild sage. For Eleanor, the season felt like a second birth, not of the land alone, but of her own life. It had been nearly a year since she stepped down from the train with her carpet bag and broken hope. Now, when she stood in the doorway of the Hale cabin, her hands resting on the gentle curve of her belly, she hardly recognized the woman she had been. Inside, laughter rang. Maggie's bright giggle mingled with the low rumble of Jonas's voice as he tried to repair a chair she had insisted on climbing. Their life was patched and humble, but it was theirs. The cabin had changed with them. Jonas had added a second room with his own hands, beams cut and lifted despite his weary muscles. Shelves lined the walls now, filled with jars of dried herbs Eleanor had gathered and prepared. A wooden sign hung outside the door, Hale in gray, herbs and help. At first, the townsfolk kept their distance, but need has a way of breaking down prejudice. Mothers began to knock quietly at her door, asking for teas to ease coughs or fevers. Children came, curious about the woman who knew stories and letters. And slowly, even grudgingly, the whispers died. They did not call her half-breed anymore. They called her Mrs. Gray, or sometimes simply Eleanor. It was enough. On an afternoon brushed with gold, neighbors gathered in a wide meadow not far from the cabin. There was no preacher, no steepled church, just a field scattered with wildflowers, a sycamore tree arching overhead, and a circle of those who had once doubted but now came bearing jars of honey, bolts of cloth, or fresh loaves of bread as gifts. Eleanor wore a dress she had sewn herself, soft brown cotton trimmed with lace, her hair braided and tied with a single feather at the end, a quiet nod to the mother she never knew. Jonas waited beneath the tree, his broad frame stiff with nerves, his hat clutched in hands more used to reins and rifles than promises. Maggie darted ahead of her mother, clutching a small bouquet of wild daisies. "Hurry, Mama," she cried, her voice ringing clear. Eleanor smiled, though her throat tightened with emotion. She walked slowly across the meadow, the hem of her dress brushing against the grass, the sky above painted in streaks of orange. When she reached Jonas, he seemed suddenly younger, boyish even, his eyes bright and uncertain. "I don't have rings," he said quietly, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "And I don't have words polished enough to give you, but I've got this land, this cabin, this child, and I want to give you all of it. Every day I'm alive." Eleanor's heart swelled. She reached for his rough hand, her voice trembling but clear. "I used to be a woman no one chose, Jonas, a bride no one sent for. But today, I choose. I choose you, and this child, and the life we will build together." The meadow fell silent. Then Maggie, unable to contain herself, shouted, "My mama and papa," her little arms flung wide as if to claim them both. Laughter rippled through the crowd, and Jonas bent his head to Eleanor's. Their kiss was not the desperate clasp of fairy tales, but a steady seal of two people who had walked through fire and come out whole. The seasons turned once more. Autumn brought a sun into their cabin, Eleanor's labor long, Jonas's hands trembling as he caught the slippery, squalling child and laid him gently in her arms. She was exhausted, drenched in sweat, but when she saw the tears in Jonas's beard as he gazed down at their boy, she whispered, "He is not a mail-order promise. He is our choice." Jonas bent low, pressing his forehead to hers. "Every day, Eleanor, my choice. Every day." Maggie tiptoed in on soft feet, eyes wide with wonder. "Is he my brother?" she asked in awe. "Yes," Eleanor said, pulling her close so both children rested against her heart. "Your brother, my son, our family." Maggie touched the baby's hand gently, then looked up at Eleanor. "You picked me too, right, even though I wasn't in your tummy." Eleanor's vision blurred. She gathered both children close. "Yes, Maggie, I chose you. Your father chose me, and now we all choose each other. That's what makes us a family, no one left behind." Jonas stood in the doorway, his eyes glistening as he watched them, one large hand braced against the frame. For the first time in years, his home was not haunted by loss, but filled with laughter and the soft chaos of belonging. Outside, the meadow stretched golden under the sun. Wildflowers swayed in the breeze, their seeds scattering, taking root where they landed. Life, Eleanor thought, was like that sometimes carried by winds harsh and cruel, but always capable of finding soil to grow again. As the first snow of winter returned, the Hale cabin glowed with light. Jonas mended the fence by day. Eleanor dried herbs by the hearth. Maggie raced about with her doll while the baby cooed in his cradle. It was not a grand life, but it was real, and it was theirs. One evening, as stars blinked cold and bright overhead, Eleanor stepped out onto the porch. Jonas joined her, his arm brushing hers, and together they watched the sky. "Do you ever think about how it began?" she asked softly. Jonas's lips twitched, almost a smile. "A letter I never wrote, a train you shouldn't have taken, a child with a soft heart." Eleanor leaned into him. "And now, a family we chose." He slid his arm around her shoulders, drawing her close. Maggie's laughter spilled from the cabin behind them, followed by the baby's tiny cry. Jonas's hand tightened on Eleanor's, steady and certain. They had no need for vows spoken aloud. The truth was in the rhythm of their days, Braze, the fire that warmed them, the children who bound them, a love not built on chance, but on choice. And in that moment, under the winter stars, Eleanor Gray knew she had finally come home. Stories like Eleanor's remind us that love is not always found in grand gestures or polished promises. Sometimes it begins in silence, in shared burdens, in the steady choice to stay when walking away would be easier. In a world that often judged her unworthy, Eleanor discovered that true family is not bound by blood alone, it is built day by day, through sacrifice, patience, and the courage to open one's heart again. Perhaps that is the lesson for all of us. No matter how many times life turns us away, it is never too late to find a place where we belong, or to choose the people who choose us back. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever found family in unexpected places? We'd love to hear. And if you want more healing tales of love and courage from the Old West, don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Healing Tales and ring the bell so you never miss a story.